If you've been making electronic music for any length of time, you've probably come across the concept of Euclidean rhythms. Without getting too deep into the mathematics, the Euclidean algorithm essentially provides a way to distribute any number of beats across any number of steps as evenly as possible. You can generate most of the best known rhythms from all sorts of musical genres this way, and by playing with more unusual combinations in parallel, you can get into complex polymetric territory very quickly. There are plenty of modules out there that offer a way to create Euclidean trigger sequences, either alongside other functionality or as standalone devices. But the lx-euclid from AtoVproject brings a unique new interface to the table. It's a dedicated 4-channel Euclidean sequencer made in collaboration with Swiss designer Lucas Bonvin. It lets you use a pair of touch-sensitive rings to edit parameters like the number of steps and the number of beats in the pattern, and there's a circular colour display which visualises the rhythms. This video is sponsored by AtoVproject, and in it I'm going to walk you through the interface of lx-euclid and show you how fast and intuitive it is to start making beats. I'm also going to explore a few patches based around Euclidean rhythms that go a bit beyond simple drum programming. I'll go through plenty of things here that you can try with any Euclidean sequencer, so hopefully you'll find these ideas useful no matter what kind of device you're using or what kind of music you're making. Here's a quick preview of what's coming up. So let's start with a look at the front panel of lx-euclid, and I'll just walk you through the interface and the controls and the inputs and outputs, and then I'll build up a couple of rhythms to show you how it works in practice. The module's 16 HP wide, and the panel is really dominated by these 2 concentric gold touch-sensitive rings here. These work a bit like the jog wheel on the original iPod. You can drag your finger around them to increase and decrease values, and you can tap in specific locations to toggle things, as you'll see. There's a full colour display in the centre for visualising the rhythms, which is really handy. Input and output wise, there are 4 outputs at the bottom, 1 for each channel. These are colour coded with LEDs, orange, red, blue and turquoise, and they have corresponding rings in the display working from the outside in. Input wise, there's a clock input when you're externally clocking it. There are 4 CV inputs, and these are freely assignable to any number of parameters on any number of channels. It's a very flexible CV mapping system. And there's a master reset input there, which will bring all the patterns back to step 1. Button-wise, the tap button here, if you're in internal clock mode, that's used as a tap tempo, so you can define how fast it plays back. It also serves as a kind of exit button that brings you back to the main page when you're in any kind of sub-menus. Talking of menus, I should probably say, don't worry, it's not very menu divey. It's not heavy on menus and options. All the key parameters are only a button push or 2 away, and with the display and the big rings, it's very intuitive. You won't spend a lot of time fiddling around in obscure menus trying to set things up. There are 4 buttons here which get you into each channel's settings, which I'll come on to in a moment. The config button here, when you're in the main screen, takes you to the kind of master settings. This is where you can load and save presets to one of the 8 preset slots. It's also where you can define the macro controls for the inner and outer ring, so that when you're in the home screen or when you're playing things back in performance, you can have these do various different things. I've got it set up so that the inner ring, when I tap in each of the sort of compass points, north, south, east and west, it will the inner ring will fill that pattern completely with beats for kind of drum fills, and the outer ring will mute. So I've got the outer ring as a kind of mute setting for the 4 channels, so I can, by tapping in these 4 corners, I can turn the channels on and off. But you could also set these up to control the number of beats or the number of steps or various other parameters for any or all of the channels. The other thing in the config is the clock source, where you can define that as internal or external. I've got that set up to be external at the moment, so I'll clock it from PAMs just off screen. And you can also set the touch sensitivity of the rings. Medium seems to work okay for me. So let's have a look at programming some rhythms. I've patched in an external clock from PAMS to the clock input, and I'm going to take channel 1 to trigger a kick drum sample in Squid Sample, and if I start PAMS up, you can see on the display it's spinning round corresponding to that clock coming in. And if I go to the channel 1 settings, on the first page here you can see that it's set to 16 steps and 4 beats, and the Euclidean algorithm will space those out evenly across those 16 steps, so we get this kind of classic 4 to the floor kick drum pattern. Let's keep that going as a metronome, and let's take channel 2 to a snare drum, and I'll go to the channel 2 settings, and basically the outer ring specifies the number of steps and the inner ring the number of beats. So if I drag around the inner ring, we've now got 7 steps across 16, and the Euclidean algorithm is spacing them out appropriately. And we can go to any number of steps within those 16. We could also reduce the number of steps altogether, so we've got 5 out of 12. And if I go back to the main screen, you'll notice now that these white dots are drifting in and out of sync because we've got 2 different meters happening. Let's go back into set it back to 16. And I'm just going to hold tab to reset it. So now we're back on the same page. The second page of settings, so if you press the channel button again, this lets you, with the outer ring, control the probability that any step will happen. So I've adjusted that down to 65. That will like randomly skip some steps basically based on how you set that percentage. So you can kind of randomly make a pattern a bit sparser. And the inner ring here will offset the pattern, so you see it kind of shifts around if you follow those red dots. So if, for example, you had a simple snare pattern like that and you wanted it to be on beats 2 and 4, you could drag it around to be offset like that. Let's bring in a hi-hat on channel 3. Let's make that quite busy. 13 out of 16. I'll leave the percentage up, but we can also hit the config button when we're in any of these channel views and we get some extra settings. This is where we can do CV mapping, which I'll come onto in one of the patches. We've also got a choice of Euclidean algorithms here. We've got the standard Euclidean and we've got exponential. And what this does, it causes the steps to bunch up near the start. Let's make it slightly sparser. So now we're getting a bit of a weighting of beats towards the front. Press config again. There's inverse exponential, and that has the opposite effect, where the beats are now stacked up towards the end of the pattern. And there's the symmetrical, which will do a kind of combination of the two of them. The first half will be exponential, the second half will be inverse exponential. So that's a way to kind of break out of the very standard familiar Euclidean patterns if you're used to hearing the same things. Let's leave this on exponential so it's a bit forward weighted. We can also here set a clock division for the clock coming in on a per channel basis. If you've got a much faster clock coming in, you can divide it down. And you can set the length of the gate. It doesn't make any difference when I'm just triggering these sounds, but if you were doing other stuff and you wanted to elongate these gates, you can set a value in milliseconds. And let's get a clap going on channel 4. Let's just offset that slightly. And let's make the kick drum a bit more interesting. And let's just get things going a bit more polymetric. So I'm going to jump to channel 4, make that 3 out of 14. Make the snare 4 out of 15, say. And now you can see on the display, if you follow the white kind of indicators, you can see they're now spinning around at slightly different rates, so we're getting this kind of complex polyrhythmic stuff happening. We could feed in a regular reset every 2 bars, say, to bring it back into some kind of order. So I've got a little reset from PAMS off screen. And now if you watch, they'll start again at noon every 2 bars. And with the macro settings I've got set up, I can tap in the compass points to mute each channel, so that's the kick drum out, snare out. So this is quite performable. And with the inner ring, tapping on those compass points does a fill. Or fills the entire pattern basically. So just with these basic settings we can get some nice complex patterns going really quickly. Let's dive into some more advanced patches. Okay, next I want to look at using lx-euclid to generate some rhythmic modulation patterns, which will modulate some parameters of a voice rather than triggering drum sounds. I'm going to use the first channel to clock a sequencer. I've got the Glasgow Synth Guild Octone over here, which is an 8-step sequencer. That's going to fire an 8-step melody into the dual harmonic oscillator, also from AtoVproject, and that's just playing a simple triangle wave to begin with. I'm going to use channels 2, 3 and 4 then to generate some other patterns which will trigger envelopes, which will then modulate some other parameters within that voice. Let's just get the sequence going. I've set up channel 1 to be 8 triggers over 16 steps. But I've gone into the config settings and changed the algo to inverse exponential rather than the straight Euclidean. Because with straight Euclidean, those 8 over 16 would be evenly spaced and it would just be a straight 8th note clock. But with the inverse exponential variation or algorithm, it's going to space those out slightly differently and give us a pattern that sounds like this. So it's still going through all 8 steps over the course of 1 bar, but the rhythm's a bit more interesting than just a straight 8th note. So that's the triangle. Let's get the next channel activated. So just unmuted channel 2 with the touch ring. And let's just use that to trigger this next envelope. I'm using Fuji from Vostok here, a bunch of envelopes in 10 HP, really handy. That envelope's going into the VCA for harmonic 3 up here. And channel 2 set to be a 6 over 16. So when those triggers are triggering that envelope, that's opening the VCA, which is adding a bit of this higher octave harmonic, which is kind of accenting certain steps, giving us little ghost notes in between other steps, immediately making that sequence feel a bit more dynamic. Next envelope, if I unmute channel 3, send those triggers to this envelope, and that's going to control the amount of wave folding. Channel 3 rhythm is a 12 over 16, offset by 1. And depending on how much of that CV I let in, get some quite drastic tone shaping there. And again, it's kind of accenting steps. Sometimes those steps fall on one of the main envelopes, sometimes they're in between. And it just makes this whole sequence feel a bit more lively. Third envelope, or channel 4. If I just unmute that. That's going to the second oscillator, which is tuned to 5th up. And that's just going to bring in some of this second harmonic of the other oscillator. Again, just rhythmically with those envelopes. So it just animates the sequence even more. Let's stick a kick drum underneath this. Of course, you can take some of these rhythmic things and use them to trigger drum sounds as well. Mult that channel 3 output to this little hi-hat. And I can just take a couple of other drum sounds triggered from PAMs. Just some really simple rhythms there. And yeah, by playing with the amounts of this modulation, that simple 8-step sequence. So I've got quite a lot more going on. If I take the modulation out again, that's what we started with. Okay, next I want to explore using the CV inputs to modulate some parameters in the pattern so that we get some evolving rhythms happening. I've got on channel 1 of lx-euclid, I'm triggering a hi-hat sound, and I'm going to have a 4/4 kick drum triggered from Pam's Pro Workout. All the drums are going to come from Squid Sample again. And I've got a kind of 5/16 pattern set up on channel 1, which sounds like this. So the 4/4 kick's just been triggered from Pam's, and then we've got that kind of 5-step hi-hat pattern there. And I've got a slow LFO from the AtoVC LFO here, which I'm rectifying up here with this little rectifier utility. So we're just getting positive CV effectively coming from that bipolar LFO. And I'm going to go into CV input 1, which I've mapped to the number of pulses. So basically, as the voltage at the CV input increases, we're going to get more pulses in the pattern. So let's just go in there. And you'll see on the screen, we're gradually going up to all 16 steps being filled in. And now similarly on channel 2, I've got this kind of tuned percussion sound. At the moment it's just playing a 4/16, offset by 2. And I'm going to go in with a bipolar LFO on this one, which I've attenuated using the MMX2 from AtoV here. So I'm just taking another slow triangle LFO, attenuating it, and we'll go into CV input 2. So that will now get sparser down to just 1, and then 2, 3, 4, and it will increase up to a few more in the pattern. Next up on channel 3, I've got a snare drum. Let's unmute that. And that's basically a 3/16 pattern, offset by 5 beats. And for this CV, I'm going to use a stepped random from Pam's, set to a division of 4 beats. So basically every bar it's going to set a new random value. And if I go in here, it means every bar we get a new pattern. So it's changing less frequently, and it's changing at 12 o'clock on that clock each time. And then finally on channel 4, I'm going to use that to clock a melodic sequence. I'm going to clock the octone sequencer, which is playing a 5-step kind of melody. And the CV input here is again going to increase the number of pulses, but I'm just going to use a slow, narrow pulse, which for 1 bar is going to increase the number of steps. And just to finish things off, I'm going to bring in a regular offbeat hi-hat from Pam's. So the 2 blue triggers are the kick and the offbeat hat. And with all the CV happening, very simple 5/16, 4/16, 3/16 and 5/16 patterns. We've got this modulation happening, which has got a kind of sense of continuity but still feels like things are evolving and changing up. Okay, for this last patch I'm going to try something a little bit different, which is to take the gate outputs of lx-euclid, attenuate them and mix them together, run that mix through a quantizer to generate a melodic CV pattern, which will be kind of influenced by the gate patterns in those individual channels of lx-euclid. I'm actually going to take 2 independent mixes to drive 2 separate voices. I'm going to use the MMX2 from AtoVproject here, which is a matrixable mixer. It means I can plug outputs 1, 2 and 3 into channels 1, 2 and 3. They'll be multed across into the second unit, and that means I can take 2 separate mixes into 2 sides of Ornament and Crime, where I'm running the scale duet quantizer, and then into the dual harmonic oscillator from AtoV, and I'm going to use the 2 sides of that as 2 independent voices. The triggers for the first voice envelope are just going to come from the same 16th note clock that I'm going to drive lx-euclid with, and it sounds like this. So at the moment I've got channels 1, 2 and 3 set up with fairly simple 3/16, 5/16 and 7/16 patterns. And if I start bringing up these attenuators on the mixer, then when these individual gates fire, they're going to add a bit of voltage to that pattern. Channel 3 is an attenuverter, so the middle is 0. So just by playing with these 3 mixer channels here, I can offset the whole thing with the bottom attenuverter, which is normal to a 10 volt voltage. So I could tune the whole thing up or down, or shift the whole thing up or down. Let's leave that for now. And let's have a listen to the second voice. Now for that I'm triggering the envelope from channel 4 of lx-euclid, which is a 7/16 pattern. And I'm taking the saw wave output of channel 2 of the DHO and I'm running it through a filter that's just off screen. Just going to give me a kind of bass voice counterpoint to the more high-pitched melody. So again, let's just bring up a couple of these attenuators on the second MM. So that's going into the quantizer. At the moment they're both set to the same scale. And we can sort of program a little bass line with these. And let's bring in the other channel again. Now at the moment they're quite predictable playing over a bar, but if we were to maybe change channel 1 to be 17 steps, channel 2 to be 18 steps, and channel 3 to be 19 steps, we now have a much more complex pattern that doesn't repeat so regularly. I'm just going to hit it with a reset. Every 4 bars. And they'll sort of drift. And just a tiny change to one of these pots can change the whole melody. And let's get a bit more modulation happening. Let's mult this first trigger pattern into the FM CV amount. So channel 2 of the DHO is going to FM through 0 the first channel, which gives us these little cool metallic little accents. And let's mult that second trigger to the second harmonic of the first voice. So we get another octave harmonic added on the steps when channel 2 is active. And let's try changing the quantizer every couple of bars as well. Just going to do a slow switch to a different scale using a slow gate from PAMS. So just with these gate patterns and mixes, we've now got quite a nice complex dual melody thing going on here. Let's just stick a few extra drums on here as well, just from PAMS channels. Just by playing with these 2 different mixes. modulation, a couple of complex interlocking voices that are all derived from the same pattern of gates here. Leave it there. Hopefully you've got a bit of an idea of what lx-euclid can do. It's definitely the quickest and most intuitive method I've come across for quickly building drum patterns, and with features like the alternative Euclidean algorithms, it offers some new rhythmic territory to explore too. If you've enjoyed the video, please do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, leave a comment and spread the word. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.